Hello, folks. Welcome back to WW2 TV and some book review or book recommendation shows. One of my most loyal subsects of viewers is my Canadian contingent. Brad, Norma, Sheldrake, the list goes on. So I could piss people off with my recommendations here. People may never talk to me again. We'll see. I've chosen more books rather than few because I happen to like reading about the Canadian sector. I, in fact, would go as far as saying it is no longer the forgotten sector. I think there have been some fantastic historians doing some fantastic work about the Canadian involvement in the Battle of Normandy. And I would now say it isn't the forgotten sector. I would say possibly Sword is the least talked about of the beaches because the focus tends to go on the British Airborne over to the east or the Commandos. But here we go. So in no particular order. So let's start with anybody who's planning a trip to Normandy next year. Brad, from on this day, military history, is on over to Normandy again next year. So an essential book. You just need to have in your backpack if you come. There may be a more recent edition than this, but this is the one I've got. Is the Canadian Battlefields in Normandy, a Visitor's Guide by Terry Kopp and Mike Bechtold. So Mike, you may know, is a frequent guest on the channel. He's also probably the world's most busy and most renowned map maker. And if you're coming to Normandy to tour the battlefields, you need maps. Of course, there's also the fantastic online resource Project 44 doing their incredible work mapping the battles of World War II with overlays of Google Earth and original aerial photos and maps and all that. But in terms of having an actual book in your pocket, you can't go wrong with this. It's the maps that are the main thing. So you can well, here's the area south of Caen. This is pushing up towards Totalize and Tractable and what have you. So yeah, this is probably, I think there was a version before this, a sort of smaller paperback version. This is the version I've got, but I think there's an updated version. But it's an essential book. You just absolutely need to have it in your backpack if you're coming over to Normandy, because you can't necessarily always access the online resources when you're trudging through the fields of Operation Totalize. So the Canadian Battlefields in Normandy, a Visitor's Guide, essential number one. You can get at the Juno Centre, amongst other places. So let's go now for detail. Again, with the book reviews I did earlier, there are people out there who will want lots of detail, people who will want a bit less detail. If you're talking about detail and the Canadians in World War II, you have to consider Mark Zelke. He has also been a guest on the channel. I didn't bring all three volumes, all three numbers of his Normandy trilogy. I just bought the last one here. So Mark Zelke, Breakout from Juno. So his three books are Juno, Holding Juno, and Breakout from Juno. Now, in fact, when you get to the third volume, you're well inland from Juno Beach. This is mostly focusing on the area south of Caen, the Battle of Falkirk. My camera's doing some weird things with autofocus that I'll try and sort that out for later on. So it may be because I'm holding up the books. So Mark Zelke is, if you want detail, but readable detail, Mark is your go-to author. He doesn't just cover the Normandy campaign; he covers Italy and Sicily and Hong Kong and you name it. He is now regarded as Canada's premier military historian, but writing about the experiences of the individuals. There's oral histories in there. There are good maps, and he interprets the history a very good way. So Mark Zelke, his trilogy of books on Normandy. If you want detail, that's where to go. One aspect of the Canadian experience in the Battle of Normandy is the fact, and we've talked about this all the time, they were up against the 12th SS. The 12th SS, the Hitler-Jugend division, responsible for a number of horrific atrocities against Canadian and British prisoners of war. And I've got 3 or 4 books in my library that deal with that, not including Tim Cook's fantastic book that covers kind of how Canada tells its history, which I didn't bring in here today because it's not really a Normandy book, but Tim Cook's writing is, of course, fantastic, and everyone knows what he does. But I'm going to start with the overview book about the murders of prisoners of war, Conduct Unbecoming, by Howard Margolin. There is another book called Murders at the Abbey by Ian J. Campbell. I've got both. they're similar, except that Conduct Unbecoming covers all the murders, whereas Murders at the Abbey concentrates on the murders at the Abbey d'Ardennes. They both include the trial of Kurt Meyer after war. They both include build-up and explanations about who the 12th SS divisions were. They kind of break down why the battles evolved the way they did, to a point where the Canadians were taken prisoner by the Germans and then some of them were murdered. If I had to pick one of the two, because of the completeness of Conduct Unbecoming, I would go for that. I do feel it's a bit harder to get these days. Last time I checked for it a year or two ago, it was sort of out of print. It may or may not be back in print again now, but it's definitely a book worth searching out. And I've got another book coming up about the murders in a second, but the overview about the situations, the way the 12th SS went about their waging of war, the reasons behind their stance with regards to prison. It's all covered there. There's no holds barred. It does go through some quite gruesome details of some of the atrocities, and it doesn't pull its punches. So if you don't want to read a book about murders of POWs, then kind of don't read it. But it is what it is. It's an important book, and I think it should be better understood that was something that Canadians, and to a slightly lesser extent the British, faced in Normandy. That there were these horrible incidents with the 12th SS. Brad is saying it is in print again as far as it's concerned. So a more personal book about the murders is this one here, Missing. So Missing is by Greg Pollard. Greg Pollard is the nephew of George Pollard. George Pollard is one of the murder victims. That's George Pollard there. He is one of those whose body has never been found, and that is it's very hard with the light there. That's Pollard's mother there on the cover of the book, who set up a place for George, her son, at the dinner table for the rest of her life, assuming sadly that her son would return one day. So this is it does cover the circumstance of the murder. Well, as my camera's doing its thing again, sorry about the focus. It's because I'm holding up the books. The camera doesn't know where to look. It does cover the circumstances of the murders, but it's more of a personal journey about the Pollard family, understanding what it is to have someone who was missing in combat, never officially reported dead. Obviously, he is dead. Obviously, he was a victim of the SS, but with a body not being found, it's a bit different. And if ever you've wondered what it would be like to be a family, to not have that resolution, to not have that closure about a person going missing in war, Missing there is a really good, very emotional read. I was lucky enough to get a copy at the Juno Center when Greg, the nephew, was there signing copies. So I was able to go with a tour group to the Abbey d'Ardennes when he was there with a group, and they were sharing the experiences. There were some various members of the Nova Scotians there, veterans of World War II who knew some of the victims who were murdered. Jacques Vico, who was the caretaker of the Abbey d'Ardennes in World War II, who was a resistant. He's since passed away. He was there talking about the recollections he had of the garden, and it was a very moving experience. And if you want to kind of understand that whole process of being a relative of someone who was the victim of a Nazi atrocity, then Missing is I wouldn't say it's an excellent read because it's very harrowing, but it's a worthwhile and rewarding and important read. So Missing by Greg Pollard, whose uncle was in the SD&G Highlanders. I'm not sure how easy that book is to find, but it's in my recommendation suggestions. Moving along to some kind of more about the Battle of Normandy, the wider battle. 7 Days in Hell. David O'Keefe, regular viewer, a guest on the channel. This is about the Black Watch snipers, but it's about the whole battalion. They famously fought in the Battle of Point 67 and beyond, Mesa on Operation Spring. He's been on the channel to talk about it there. It's as good or better possibly than his Dieppe book, in that he spoke to more people who served in this unit, and it takes you through those events of July, but also gives you a background about the regiments. This is the Canadian Black Watch, so it kind of gives you an idea about the the typical atypical Canadian unit, how they go to war, and then their experience of the Battle of Normandy, involving this particular tragic assault, moving over through the wheat fields up towards the high ground south of Caen in July. It's a fantastic read. I recommend it thoroughly. The next in that regard of the Battle of Normandy, Terry Kopp is a legend when it comes to Canadian military history, and I think Fields of Fire is probably the most outstanding book about the Canadians' role in the whole Battle of Normandy. So it takes you from the beaches right the way through the battles for Caen, the battles inland, Totalised, Tractable, the Falaise Gap, and it's Terry Kopp, who taught at Wilfrid Laurier. He was on the top of his game when he wrote this book, and it doesn't pull its punches. It's a bold assessment of Canadian forces. It's different as well in that it goes against that earlier writing by Canadian historians where everybody was talking about how crap the leadership was and how bad the Allies were performing, and how, by contrast, how well the Germans performed. And it's the opposite of that. This is it doesn't avoid criticism if it needs to be said, but it's a book that is honest. It tells you about what the Canadians did in the Battle of Normandy without insulting them unnecessarily. It's balanced. It's just a fantastic book. I would say if I was running out of my library with my house on fire, Fields of Fire be one of those books I would be trying to throw out the window to make sure it survives. It's a brilliant read. So that's my next recommendation. And thank you for agreeing with me there, Brad. Are we doing all right so far? Are you okay with my choices? And as Brad says, David O'Keefe's book about the Black Watch, it isn't just about the Black Watch. I should agree with Brad there. It does talk about the Second Division. And is it better than the Dieppe book? I think because it's not tackling a controversial subject, it's perhaps it's a different sort of book, really. I don't want to kind of talk about better. Next one. Now, this one, I'm going to go out on a limb and think that most people like Alex Black and Brad won't know this book. And I only had this book because I was able to take the author of it on a tour about 20 years ago. So it was a self-published book. Let's see if we can find it. It's called Gone is the Angel by Robert Forbes. Now, Robert Forbes was on a tour of mine 20 years ago. So the angel he's referring to in this is Wing Commander Lloyd Chadbourne. So Lloyd Chadbourne was a Canadian Spitfire pilot. He flew above the beaches of Dieppe. He fought in Normandy. He was killed in a tragic accident on, from memory serves, June the 7th, when his wingtip collided, maybe June the 9th, with that of his wingman. And he's buried in the Commonwealth War Grove Cemetery in Ronville. So we haven't really talked much on this channel about Canadian aviators specifically. Obviously, Canada provided a huge number of pilots and air crews for Bomber Command, Fighter Command, and Lloyd Chadbourne, if he was an American pilot, there'd have been 5 movies about him already, because he was cocky, he was arrogant, he had a big swooping head of blonde hair. He used his own initials for the squadron codes of his Spitfires. He was a typical fighter pilot, dashing, and 23 years old, I think he was when he was killed. And the book also covers the fact that he died, and he was an orphan when he died. His parents had been killed years ago, and he died with no family, except, spoiler alert, the book goes on to explain how he had in fact fathered a child in England with a girl he was having a relationship with, and this son of the angel of Lloyd Chadbourne eventually goes to Canada to the Chadbourne squadron that still exists. I think it's an air cadet squadron, and he went in there and had a connection with the unit there, and kind of traced his father that he didn't know, of course, growing up, and his mother had never told him who his father was. It's an amazing story. So I hope you can find it there. So Gone is the Angel, the biography of another unsung Canadian hero, Wing Commander Lloyd Chadbourne, by Robert Forbes. So I have no idea if that's available online. I'm lucky enough that I got a copy from Robert directly. He signed it to me, of course, and I've had it about 20 years. It's a great read. Hopefully you can find it. I know certainly if you can't find the book, there is now a lot of information about Lloyd Chadbourne online. I believe there's a Spitfire and his markings. The Museum of Flying is the Museum of Flying in Ontario somewhere. You guys who are from Canada will correct me if I'm wrong on that. But Lloyd Chadbourne, incredible fighter ace. Brilliant story. In a similar vein, and this book is available, Battle Diary, From D-Day and Normandy to the Zuyder Zee and VE Day by Charles Cromwell Martin. So he was a member of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, Sergeant Major, and it's a typical, it's my green screen is picking up the fact this is a green book, so it's putting the background through it. He was a Sergeant Major on D-Day. He landed there in front of the famous Canada House at Bernier-sur-Mer. He fought all the way through to the Netherlands, and he just a great soldier. It's kind of up there with Sidney Jarry's book 18 Platoon, the British book, as a memoir. I would probably go out and say it's the best Canadian Normandy veteran memoir. Obviously, there's some of the ones we talked about in Italy with the guy whose name has escaped me right now. You'll mention it. He's come up in lots of shows. Brad is saying Martin's book is a must-read. No question. I think I'm doing it right. I think I'm pleasing Brad with my choices so far. It's just, if you want to follow one person's story, Moat, there we go. Yeah, Farley Moat. That's who we're talking about with the Italy books. Thank you. I knew you'd come in there. So I know this is available. Mine is a signed copy. Again, Charles Cromwell Martin, DCMMM, and it's a fantastic insight. It doesn't talk about grand strategy, and he doesn't really talk about generals and what they're up to. It's not that at all. It's simply about his experiences leading men in the Battle of Normandy, and it is what and beyond. It is what it is. Charlie Martin, Battle Diary. Got it. Essential reading. Next one, and again, this is via my old touring days. I met this next author because he toured with my company. He actually toured with my guide Sean Claxton, who has also written about the Canadians. So Neil Stewart was a Sherman tank commander, and he wrote, I think, 3 books. I think one of them was self-published. This is not the self-published one. It's got a pop-up publication, Steal My Soldiers' Hearts. And there he is on the back cover there. So he toured with my company about 15 years ago. And it's similar to the Charlie Martin book, except he was in a Sherman. And he was involved in some of the fighting inland from Juno Beach, the push towards Carbiquet Airport, that kind of thing. And it's perhaps not quite as good as Charlie Martin's book, but it's nearly as good. It talks about DD tanks. It talks about Fireflies. It's a Canadian Sherman tanker's vision of how armor was used, his personal experiences. He's critical of certain tactics used by the Canadians. It is what it is. It's a fantastic book. So it talks about a Canadian tankman who fought in the Northwest European campaign. And so there you are. Steal My Soldier's Heart by Neil J. Stewart is my next recommendation. There's still a few more to go. Another, I would say, essential read in terms of Canadians in the Battle of Normandy is this one here, David Berkerson, Battalion of Heroes, the Calgary Highlanders in World War II. So it's not just Normandy, it takes the story on. I'm hoping I'm going to get another thumbs up from Brad for this one there. It's an absolute classic. So Berkerson's father, I believe, was in the unit, if I remember correctly. Lots of maps, lots of personal insight. It's like an earlier version of the kind of book that David O'Keefe did about the Black Watch. It's lots of photos of the men, the commanders, the officers, lots of background about who the people were, platoons, blah, 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 blah. Thumbs up from Brad there. I seem to be on a roll so far with these books. So it's a classic. It's kind of like think of it as like a Band of Brothers type book in that it tells you who the commanders are. It follows that one unit through. So it's about a battalion rather than a company, but it's a fantastic read. And I think that went out of print for a while and now he's back in print again now. So David Berkerson, Battalion of Heroes, the Calgary Highlanders in World War II is a cracking book. When I did the earlier show about my general D-Day books, one of the books that got 2 people in the comments, including Brad, who said, why, you should mention it, Stopping the Panzers by Mark Milner, The Untold Story of D-Day. So it isn't really, it is about D-Day, but it's about the planning, it's about the unfolding of the battles, and it particularly covers, and this is its strength, that period just after D-Day when they're engaged in the 12th SS. He busts myths wide open about the German tactics and the supposed prowess of the 12th SS, and it's an essential read. If you're one of those people watching this who thinks that that the 12th SS were incredibly efficient and fantastic soldiers and an elite formation and all that kind of stuff that you hear. That Mark Milner's book kind of puts all that to bed and says, you know what, they were thoroughly bested by the Canadian and British armor in Normandy, and he's been on the channel, of course. Mark Milner, he was a star guest that we have Ways, not last year, the year before. So interesting that Bergerson has some mixed opinions about his writing. Past Blast, I've heard mixed things about Bergerson. Someone criticized his Blood on the Hills book. I haven't read Blood on the Hills. I've only read Calgary Highlands book, and I think it's good. So yeah, Stopping the Panzers. If you want to understand, if you read that along with the Neil Stewart book about a Sherman tank crewman, this would give you the kind of the context of how did the Canadians go into Normandy with armor. What were they trying to do with it? How did they deploy? How did they deal with the threat posed by the 12th SS, etc., etc., etc.? It kind of fills in the gaps. Those two books would work really well. I'll hold them up again. Work well by well as a double act. Steal My Soldiers' Hearts and Stopping the Panzers would give you a really good, thorough understanding of armor as used by the Canadians in the Battle of Normandy. Am I doing all right so far? Brad seems to be giving me the thumbs up for everything. Milner's book is another must-read. And indeed, it's not just for anyone interested in Canada. It's anyone interested in just exactly the how the Germans used their forces, and the 12th SS were far from elite. They could be good at what they did, and they could be terrible at what they did. It's how wars work. So another essential book in terms of understanding how the British and Canadians waged their combat in Normandy is The Guns of Normandy, A Soldier's Eye View by George G. Blackburn. This, if you like 25-pounders, if you like field artillery, if you want to understand how essentially Montgomery and everybody below him wanted to use steel and the power of AGRAs, so Army Group Royal Artillery, and how that was a massive, great winning arm of the Allies in Normandy, this is the book for you. Guns of Normandy takes you through what 25-pounders did, what they were supposed to do. It is, he was there. Blackburn wrote several books. This is the only one I have. But if you don't understand artillery in the Battle of Normandy, you don't understand the Battle of Normandy. It's as simple as that. Artillery was one of the things the Allies did really, really well. Not necessarily every theatre of World War II, but they did it very well in Normandy. People are still debating who had the best artillery. Is it the Americans? Is it the British? Is it the Allies? It's definitely not the Germans. The Germans had some good kit at the beginning of the war, but they didn't know how to use it. You've heard this said on World War II TV many times. But yeah, Guns of Normandy, an absolute essential read there. And then what do we have left? One more book to go. And if you're a novice, if you don't know anything about Juno Beach, if you have read lots of books about the American Airborne or the British Paras and glider-borne troops up at Pegasus Bridge, and you want to know more about Juno Beach, but you're entry level, perhaps you don't want to go to the Mark Zelke level of 3 books about Juno Beach, I would say a really good book to start with is this, which is Juno by Ted Barris. So Ted is another legend within Canadian history, and he writes in a very accessible, very readable, page turning, but without adding any drama that wasn't there. He's, as you know, he's been on the channel a few times. He's done the Battle Atlantic. He's written about the Great Escape. He's written about all aspects of World War II. Highly decorated in terms of recognition of his work in history, and it's probably the best single volume book about Juno Beach. Especially, as I say, if you're coming to this subject fresh. Of course, there isn't the detail in a single book that you would find in a more detailed book about a particular unit. And there's books in my collection about the Regina Rifles and the 1st Hussars. I did a Green Zone Rifle. Didn't bring them all in here to the office to do it because it would be too many books, and my camera is doing weird things again. But Ted Barris is a great entry-level book. What it will probably do, though, is if you like it, you'll then want to do a deeper dive. It'll be like, okay, well, I like this now. Now I want more detail, and then you'll maybe move on to David O'Keefe or Mark Milner or Mark Zelke. But as a single volume book, it's got to be up there. I could do a list, but I think if you watch it, Gerard, you can just write down the titles of the books you're interested in. I might have time to go through and write the list out, but I don't blame me if I don't. So there we are. There are some books I didn't mention, including that one there. There are a couple of books about the Canadians I have not enjoyed, that I won't necessarily name them now. But that's my kind of first look at books covering the Canadian angle. And when you consider how many books I've just covered, it's been about 15 books or something like that, you'll realize that it's far from the forgotten beach. You go into the Juno Beach Museum these days, there's lots of books there. I think it was a lesser talked about beach, perhaps 20 years ago, but I no longer think it is the lesser talked about beach. I think Canada has done a fantastic job in recent years of getting its story out there. And so I think, angling it as the forgotten beach is now probably incorrect. It's like, I think Burma is no longer the forgotten campaign for the British Army. People like Robert Lyman and many others have done some fantastic work out there. I would say that isn't the forgotten campaign. That's what happens in the swings and roundabouts and the ebb and flow of how things go. Gaps in markets are seen, and people fill those gaps. So I would say that Sword Beach is probably the beach to tackle next. And as I said in the review show earlier today, Stephen Fisher is going to be tackling that with his new book next year. Longest Day, the movie, doesn't help in its complete ignoring, basically, of the Canadian involvement in Normandy and June the 6th. Let's not go there. What the movie does, some of what the movie does, it does well. Some of what the movie does, it doesn't do so well. But it's what it leaves out, I think, it can be very frustrating. So there we are. That is the my assessment of Canadian military history. You may agree with some of the titles, you may disagree, you may have other titles. I haven't read every single book. There's lots of self-published memoirs of Canadian veterans. There's aspects that other books that I didn't bring in here that perhaps cover the whole of World War II rather than just Normandy, or the Ellen Besner's work on Canadian Jews, for example, doesn't just cover Normandy, so I didn't bring that in there. But I might do a second round of shows about, or a second show about other Canadian books that don't concern Normandy. We'll see. I don't know. But right now, I'm going to leave it there. We are now, 2.5 hours away from today's proper show. Ian Ballantyne is going to be on to talk about British submarine operations in the Indian Ocean, mostly in 1945. And Ian is the author of Deadly Trade, for my money, one of the best books about submarine warfare. It covers the whole history of submarine warfare. That is later on. Did I pass the test, Brad? My recommendations are okay? I think I could have ruined a friendship with Brad there if I'd mentioned the book that he didn't like. But I think I survived. So there we are. So I'll see you all again later on today. It's Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying enjoy the 2.5 hours you have before I'm back again. Cheers. Bye.